how does the war in Iran affect Russia's economy and Russia's Arctic energy sector? Welcome to the Circumpolar. I'm your host. My name is Serafima Andreeva, and today with me we have a guest who is an expert on precisely hydrocarbons and Russia, Arild Moe, Professor Arild Moe, who has also recently written a book, this book right here, about Russian climate, hydrocarbons and sanctions in the Russian Arctic, together with Anna Korppoo. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. So my first question then to you, Arild, is that the United States war against Iran, it has been called a windfall for Russia in many ways, and that they benefit from it. But does this match what you are seeing in the Russian Arctic energy sector?
Yes, obviously, a lot have been said about this implication for Russia. And there is absolutely some truth in it. We have studied developments in the Russian Arctic and the hydrocarbon sector over longer term. And of course, we were not aware of the war when we concluded the book just late last year. But there is a question if some of the issues we bring up the book are still very much relevant, even with the war going on. But let us take us the short term first. Yes, Russia has benefited since sanctions were partially lifted, not fully. Some sanctions against Russian oil were lifted. Russia was able to sell more oil than it would otherwise have had, and that is quite clear. But I think the interesting question is more the longer-term impact. Of course, we don't know when the war in the Middle East will end, assuming that it will end in the sort of foreseeable future and that oil flows from that region again will start. I think Russia's position does not necessarily look so much better for the longer term. My point is that the Middle East war has once again exposed the vulnerability of energy supplies to many countries, and especially long-distance supplies. And clearly from Russia, and LNG from Russia, they are transported over longer distances. I think some countries will reassess their dependence of such long-term deliveries. They are vulnerable. And we have, of course, also in the same period seen problems for Russian LNG. I'm thinking about the LNG carrier in the Mediterranean that was attacked and is still just left without crew and without any navigation in that area. Clearly a very dangerous situation, and that could mean that some countries are reassessing their future dependence on long-term supplies from Russia, and that means also the Russian Arctic.
And in this recent book, you describe the Russian Arctic dream economy as no longer sustainable. What does this mean?
When we coined that phrase, we had in mind that some of the assumptions for development in the Russian Arctic looked not so realistic. They presuppose a degree of external interest and investment that is, I think, quite dubious, and they clearly are not taking into account the longer-term impact of climate change. And let us take the first issue first. The Russian Arctic has been developed as an export-oriented business. That goes for both oil and liquefied natural gas. And the resource base is impressive, but the investment needs are also extremely high. So you need to have foreign investment to get these projects off the ground. And until before the war, this looks like a quite successful strategy, especially with regard to liquefied natural gas. The question now is whether investors, be them foreign, be them Western, if that is possible, even Asian investors, look at the Russian Arctic the same way. It can be argued that the war in Ukraine and the sanctions that were imposed has made a Russian long-term investment look much less certain. The risk that there could be new conflicts, new sanctions, is clearly a very big problem for long-term investors. And then over the longer term, the issue is what about the market for these products? And then climate change, changes in the international markets could have a break on the interest in supplies from the Arctic.
I mean, the European Union is preparing to ban Yamal LNG, but still in the first 3 months of this year, we have seen that they have paid almost 3 billion euros to Yamal. And what do you see? I mean, we have the war in Ukraine, Russia's war against Ukraine. We have the United States and Israel war against Iran happening at the same time. How do you think these wars will affect, or if they are prolonged significantly, how will they affect the EU and Russia, you could say, relationship?
It is clear that Russian LNG has played a quite important role in Europe over the last years. Paradoxically, Russian LNG from Yamal LNG has helped sort of the European energy supply system by increased deliveries. We used to think that the liquefied natural gas market globally was evolving so fast that Russian LNG would not any longer be so important in the years ahead. And in European energy planning, LNG from various sources are supposed to take over the niche that Russia has had. And that is still, I think, true. But again, the reference to what has happened in the Middle East, also in Europe, I believe there will be a reassessment of the role of LNG and the vulnerability of LNG supplies. So you could say that what has happened in the Middle East is giving a premium to gas supplied via pipeline, safer solution. However, the availability of pipeline gas to Europe has its limitations. Norway, you can do it from North Africa. But the need to develop domestic energy sources, I think, is a major long-term effect of what is going on in the Middle East. And that is not only the case in Europe, but also elsewhere. Unfortunately, it means, at least in the short term, coal in many countries. Over the longer term, it could give an impetus to more renewables, domestically sourced renewables. In the coming year and next year, when Russian gas is supposed to be phased out completely, Europe will have a constrained energy supply situation. I
mean, and if we also go to something that also is affecting both Europe and is coming from Russia or is affecting Russia as well, is the current state of the shadow fleet. And things related to that. I mean, you mentioned how the LNG carrier Arctic Metagas was destroyed in the Mediterranean in March. And what would you say that the current state of these vessels tells us about vulnerabilities? Can this be tied to the Arctic in any way, tied to these future projections?
Yes, the shadow fleet, which is a quite loose concept. It's not one fleet, it's ships belonging to various owners, not Russian owners, at least not directly, but serving Russian terminals, bringing Russian oil to the markets that accept Russian oil, has been an exploding business. These tankers sail and bring oil without the limitations of the price ceiling that has been imposed by Western countries on Russian oil exports. As long as the sanctions are intact, I think that the shadow fleet will continue to play a role. Although there are many measures taken to try to limit the operation of the shadow fleet tankers. The big concern with them is environmental, that they are old, not necessarily super old, but old, and are sailing in ways that are increasing the danger of collisions, turning off their AIS senders, for instance. In addition to the economic aspect of their operations, that they are hiding their identities, changing flag and names and so on. And of course, bringing Russian oil to markets outside the sanctions. So it has been a quite extraordinary development, with these ships now occupying a quite big share of international tanker fleet, and I don't see them disappearing.
You mentioned the environmental aspect. When you talked about the European Union, you talked about climate, and there is one external factor we cannot avoid in any way, which is more predictable than many wars per se, which you also talk about here. It is the climate crisis and the environmental, you could say, pending disasters that are just waiting to happen, also hitting the Arctic way harder than many other regions in the world. So when you were writing this book together with Anna, when you were going through the energy aspect of it, how did you weigh these concerns and how do you foresee that they are affecting the future economy, essentially the future energy sector in Russia?
We tried to understand how this looks from the Russian side. And to what extent climate concerns play a role in development of the Russian Arctic. And to put it briefly, I think we can say that they play a minor role. There is a lot of climate science in Russia, and climate change in the Arctic is well documented. But the general conclusion is that the changes, particularly thawing permafrost, can be managed. So that doesn't really change the development plans to any significant extent. I would climate change is also about the global market changes and how hydrocarbons will be perceived and paid for in the future. And the Russian position is that yes, there is a change going on. There is a transition away from hydrocarbons, a slow one, but Russia will be able. But there will be a need for hydrocarbons, and Russia will supply those hydrocarbons. So the Russian climate policy is very much about finding or keeping a room for Russian hydrocarbon exports. They don't deny climate change, but they are arguing that they are in the best position to deliver the energy that will be needed.
But then can I ask you a little bit more of an explorative question then, based on this thorough research that you have done together on climate in Russia, what keeps you up at night?
Well, the climate crisis is global, and it is something that is definitely going to change our world in the coming decades. But exactly how fast and how is difficult, and it's not happening over one night. It's happening more slowly, but still, without doubt, it will have an enormous effect. In the short term, of course, the concern is what is happening inside Russia. A nation of economic decline and military aggression is very, very troublesome.
And if you could provide some form of policy recommendation or any action suggestions based on this fundamental research, what would you say?
That is a hard one. Depends on whom you are really directing the policy advice to. In the case of Europe, I see that continued dependence on continued development of energy sources that are domestically sourced, or at least sourced within the larger European area, is going to continue to be a very, very high priority. That being said, at some point there will be a need to rebuild relations with Russia. It will be difficult, it will take time. And I think thinking about that when the war in Ukraine at some point ends will be a big challenge, where Russia cannot be taken off the map. There will have to be some sort of contact and cooperation. And doing that in the way that does not further aggravate the situation, political situation in Russia, will be a very big challenge.
Thank you so much, Arild. Let's hope that the challenges will be adequately addressed. At least I know that many of them are addressed in the book. Thank you so much for coming here, and thank you for listening.